It's very hard and challenging to have a kind of a keynote speech after the two extremely interesting and motivating presentations. So I'll try to do my best in the next 15 or 20 minutes or so. In the first presentation by Mr. Donfried, there was the definition of the cultural diplomacy which was given. And that definition, I want to pick up on that because my intervention is going to be based on that. But I'm going to try to show you a bit different point of view on cultural diplomacy and how cultural diplomacy can actually be misused in some of the cases. The definition which we saw on the screen was that the cultural diplomacy is the exchange of ideas, traditions, values, and other aspects of culture and identity with the name of strengthening relationships, enhancing socio-economic cooperation, or promoting national interests. It was also said here that the goal of the cultural diplomacy is to educate, enhance, sustain relationship with the name of trust building. These are all noble definitions and the noble goals. However, we have many cases in history, and particularly even today as we speak, where cultural diplomacy is used for promoting the national interests which are, I'll be simplistic, wrong, which are imperialistic and which actually do not serve the protection of the human rights or do not serve the bettering of the societies, but are actually to the detriment of it. Joseph Nye was mentioned here as the coiner of the term soft power. In 2006, he had an interesting article in the Foreign Policy magazine where he said that country soft power can come from three different sources. He mentioned there the culture, political values, and the foreign policies. And he also, what was one interesting thing he did after that was that he also defined what he would mean under these three. When he mentioned culture, he said, in places where the culture is attractive to the others. When he said political values, in the brackets he put, when the political values live up to them, or where the country who promotes these political values lives up to these political values at home and abroad. And when he mentioned foreign policies, he put in brackets, when the foreign policies are seen as legitimate and having moral authority. Now, we have a number of cases in the world where all this is being done, but neither of the three preconditions are actually met, where the soft power is projected, where the cultural diplomacy is used, in the cases where the culture is not attractive to the others, where the political values are not upheld at home by the country who puts it forward, and where the foreign policy goals are actually not legitimate and do not have the moral authority. In the same article, by the way, Joseph Nye said that soft power, you can, and I use in certain cases soft power and cultural diplomacy interchangeably because one could be the facet of the other, that soft power was very well used by people like Hitler, Stalin, and Mao. So when we talk about cultural diplomacy, it's all good. It all can serve the noble goal as it was presented here. But at the same time, there are cases when it actually serves other ambitious hard power goals and imperialistic goals. And I wouldn't dare to go beyond of certain areas of my expertise. So I'll just give you an example of Georgia, the part of the world which is Europe, the part of the world which is aspiring to join the European institutions, but also the part of the world which has a very traumatic Soviet experience and the negative experience of dealing with Russia. And what we're talking about here, what I'll be talking about here in the next few minutes, is not a theory, it's practice. It's not something that I've read, it's something I've felt. It's not something that has happened and is a finite, fait accompli, something which is actually going on as we speak. You know, I'm 35 years old. In these 35 years, I've seen 5 wars, including the wars for independence. Oh, by the way, today is the 26th of May, which is the day of independence for Georgia. So from in 1921, in 1918, and it's the independence from Russian Empire, obviously. So this has been the wars for independence in the 90s. This has been the wars, the civil wars in the country. This has been the ethnic wars between different groups, and it has been a regular international warfare in 2008 between Georgia and Russia. The reason I mention this is that in almost all of these cases, what happened after the wars was that we've seen a projection of Russian soft power, usage of the cultural diplomacy with the purpose of either blurring the history or putting forward the alternative narratives, or, as some say, creating the alternative reality just with the simple aim of diluting what is right and what is wrong. I was in the Atlantic Council last week. There was a very interesting discussion there about Russia's soft power abroad. And you probably all heard of Masha Gessen, who is the Russian journalist who now writes abroad about Putin and about what is happening in Moscow. She had a very interesting point. She said that the reason why Russia uses its propaganda is not to distort facts. It's not just to promote its own thoughts and values, but it's also to create alternative reality in which people start asking questions, is anything right at all? So if one says that something is black, they say something is white. And then people would ask the question, so it's maybe not black and not white, so there's no truth in that kind of reality. Now, the reason I'm talking about this is that we actually see, when I mentioned what the soft power can mean, where the cultural diplomacy is used, there are certain international realities where cultural diplomacy can be very effective, where soft power is basically default. It should be used. If you take the case of Georgia and Russia, you'll see a lot of commonalities. You see two nations who have similar religions. They are both Orthodox religions, Christian Orthodox. Now, by the way, in the 18th century, when Georgia decided to choose the pro-Russian path, the main argument they chose that path was that they thought that the Christian kinship with Russia would save Georgia from surrounding Muslim enemies at that time. So that is a strong kinship on which the religion is a strong kinship on which the relations were based. If you look at the common history, you would see that in the last 300 years or so, the history has been shared. So identity is more or less shared between the two nations. But if you look at the polls currently about how many, what is the percentage of population that considers Russia to be enemy, or considers Russia in a negative sense, you would see it's over 70%, over 80%. If you look at the same polls in Russia, by the way, you would be surprised, it's almost the same number. In one of the recent polls, Georgia was perceived to be the biggest enemy of Russia right after the United States and Estonia. So you have these three huge nations that Russia perceives to be the enemy: US, Estonia, and Georgia. Now, why is this the problem? This is the problem because there are certain realities, like the one I just mentioned, where the cultural diplomacy is used to portray the reality that the imperialistic vision is based on. We have, and I'm going to give you concrete examples. I don't want to be too much theoretical about that. There are certain instruments that Russia uses to exert its soft power and to promote its cultural diplomacy in the countries like Georgia. One of them is church. And I said we have Christian, Orthodox Christianity on which this kinship has been based. Some of the values that the church is promoting in Georgia are the values that would not be acceptable to many people in the society in Georgia, but also in the world. For instance, ideas such as the intolerance towards the minorities of any kind. And I'm not talking here only about sexual minorities, which is usually used as a case. But no, the minorities of all kinds, whether these are the national, whether these are the racial, whether these are any kind of minorities, intolerance towards them. And we've seen a number of events in Georgia which have been supported by these kind of groups, where the bottom line is that it's the majority who should be dictating certain rules of the game. And it is done through a very nice symposiums, to very nice events, including the cultural additions to it. So it's not done through a hard point, it's not done through coercion, it's done through a very acceptable from one glance instruments. We've seen, there was a question here, there were examples brought here about the movies and about the culture, how this is being translated into visual art. We've seen a number of concerts, a number of movies created in the recent years, which are precisely aimed at promoting the kind of vision that suits the foreign policy goals, which once again are not a legitimate foreign policy goals. We're talking here about the foreign policy goals, which is based on the notion that a country has a right to intervene into domestic affairs of a neighboring country. We're talking here about the foreign policy goal, which is based on the notion that a country cannot choose its own friends and alliances because the neighboring country is against it. And so we're talking here about promoting these negative values through the usage of drama, of film, of visual arts, and other kinds of cultural instruments. Same goes for the non-governmental sector. We have seen a number of new non-governmental organizations in my country which are using very effectively these kind of cultural diplomacy instruments to portray the alternative view about what the past was. To portray that the past in the Soviet Union was good, as opposed to being oppression, as opposed to being the violation of the human rights and the violation of the rights of self-determination of the peoples. And that is being done through the money which is being injected in the activities of these groups, and that is being done through the concrete cultural events. So we have the cases here today in that part of the world where either history is presented in an alternative way through the instruments of cultural diplomacy, or where current events are presented in an alternative way also through the same instruments. Yesterday was an interesting day, a big day, because two female freedom fighters have been released. You probably all know that. One most notable of that is Nadia Savchenko, who is the Ukrainian lady who has been held hostage for 2 years in Russia. If you only knew what has been the news coverage of that in the Russian TV, what has been the coverage of that in different events that Russian-supported NGOs have been portraying, you would be surprised that we're talking here about a lady who was a murderer, who was in the armed forces, but not somebody who was a fighter for her own for her own country. So what I'm saying is that as we speak about cultural diplomacy in terms of positive repercussions, and I would agree that in most of the cases this can be used and is used with the name of confidence building, with the name of bridging, building bridges. There are cases in the world as we speak today when exactly the same instruments are being used for completely different purpose. And I'm going to end this with the one question to which I do not have an answer. The question is what to do about that. Because when you ask that question, obviously the things that come to mind in the answer, what to do about that, are precisely the things that, that the other side will be propagating, such as close down the media channel, or such as, do not allow the functioning of the NGOs, or such as, restricting the freedom of expression because that is something that is simply not true. So these are the questions to which I do not have an answer. Once again, going back to the event last week in Atlantic Council, a lot of people, particularly those who came from Russia, I would say rather consensually said, one thing you should do is that if there is propaganda, you to shut it down. Now, I'm not sure that is the right way to approach it. But what I want to show with this small intervention is that there are questions to which the answers are not so easily to be found. And there are phenomena like cultural diplomacy, like soft power, which in many cases, as we speak today, are being used for the wrong purposes. I'll stop here and leave the time for the Q&A. Thank you. Should I moderate? Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. Can you switch the microphone? Yes. Is that Putin that's running the? Because he's rather a master of the subversive arts. So do you? As I apologize, I don't know a lot about it. But is that Putin's kind of goal? And what is the goal of wanting his people, and why does he want the 70% of the people to, why does he want them to be?
Yeah, I see. Yeah. I mean, the easy answer is yes to the first one, but if you dig into it, why that is being done, for several reasons. One reason is that Russia has exerted hard power in its near abroad, for the last 15 years or so without hesitation. It has used force. It has invaded at least 2 countries. It has supported the coup d'etats. It has used economic sanctions. It has used, hybrid warfare. So, I mean, you name it. Anything that comes to mind when you mention the phrase hard power has been used. What we see recently is that there's a switch from hard power to soft power, which obviously envisages such things as cultural diplomacy. And the reason for that is that with the hard power, you can claim the territory, you can acquire the territory, you can acquire a part of population. But with the soft power and with this kind of cultural diplomacy events, what you can do is that you can aim to acquire the hearts and minds of the people. What they have failed to do in these last 15 years is to contribute to the pro-Russian sentiments in the countries in its near neighborhood. I mean, the good case in question is Ukraine, which is, which is considered to be probably the closest country identity-wise to Russia, and is now probably the biggest enemy of Russia in Europe. I compete with Georgia, but I'm not sure who is where. So, but what they have failed to do was to win hearts and minds of Ukrainians, because now if you look at any polls, Ukraine is completely leaning towards where Russia is not. So it has become completely anti-Russian because of this hard power politics that Russia has exerted.
Thank you very much. My name is Jose. First of all, thank you for your keynote. And being a young deputy foreign minister is really a huge thing. So you're an inspiration for many young people. So how do you see the role of international relations in the area of cultural diplomacy, knowing that you have worked in the fields of international relations? And the second question is, where do you see the place or the role of Georgia in the European Union, or the way you can address cultural diplomacy?
On the first one, I think I agree with the definition I mentioned, where you need to have cultural diplomacy as part of your overall diplomacy to meet some of the goals of yours. The countries who do not have illegitimate foreign policy goals, by illegitimate I mean conquering somebody or acquiring an extra territory or things like that, I think cultural diplomacy is a normal and sometimes quite effective tool to reach your goals. For instance, what we have done is that we have tried to promote Georgian culture in the parts of the world where nobody knows anything about it, and vice versa. We have tried to, as an exchange, bring in Georgia the other cultures. We've had, for instance, the days of Nigeria and Ecuador in Georgia, and the days of Georgia in those two countries. The same goes for Indonesia, same goes for Australia, same goes for the Pacific Islands. So it's one of the ways to promote your country with the name of, obviously, rationally speaking, of then attracting more tourists, attracting more investments, putting your country on the map. So I think it's important, and it is used and practiced very well. But the problem is that it's expensive. So for the countries who do not have a lot of money, it's always a matter of priority. Where do you put that? Where do you invest that money? In the cultural diplomacy, which does not yield immediate results, or somewhere else which you can count as yielding immediate results. What was the second question? Can you remind me?
The role of Georgia in the European Union and how you use that to address the cultural diplomacy.
Yeah, well, Georgia wants to become the member of the European institutions, European Union, NATO, and that there's a strong support of that. Over 70% of the country's population aspires to that. But that's not so easy, because one thing that prevents it is precisely the position of Moscow, who has said continuously that it can go at length to prevent its neighbors from choosing its own foreign policy alliances. And they've used force in Georgia to prevent further integration into NATO. They've used force in Ukraine to make sure that Ukraine did not go towards the European Union and sign association agreement. So that's one thing that prevents allies from taking Georgia, Ukraine, and those nations in. But to go back to the role of the country, I think the small countries like Georgia in a very volatile neighborhoods, which are region with conflicts, is to be a peaceful nation, but also to play an active diplomatic role in the neighborhood, wherever you could contribute, you can contribute, whether it is through your contribution to the peacekeeping operations, or contribution to the various international missions, or whether it's contribution to the international diplomatic efforts. I mean, you name it. There are many venues and opportunities where this can be done. Usually the mistake that the small countries make is that they attempt to disappear from the radar of international diplomacy. I'm a believer of the opposite, where the small country should aspire to be at the radar of the international diplomacy, just simply because when you're on the radar, you have many opportunities, and you can use those opportunities for the better of your nation.